Hey, Patrick.
Hey, Michael J. How you doing?
I am doing fantastical. I'm doing super fantastical, and I'm super excited about Legacy.
Yeah, as 2017 comes to a close, kind of interesting seeing where the sort of where Legacy is at going into 2018, a year that will have an increased level of high-profile Legacy tournaments compared to recent years.
Yep. That's driven by a couple of things, right? One of the important things is these new team tournaments, right? The team tournaments are 1/3 standard, 1/3 modern, and then now 1/3 Legacy. So this is Pro Tour too, right? That they're going to have. So that's going to be Legacy. Is it the first time Legacy's ever been on the Pro Tour?
No. I can't help but recall that 1/3 of Worlds in 2007 was Legacy, and if you don't want to count
well,
if you don't want to count that, there was also Legacy back when. I mean, there was a Legacy Pro Tour way back, right? I mean, I don't know. What do I know?
Well, 2007 Legacy at Worlds, that was in New York. I remember that. That was cool. Who came in second in that Worlds?
No idea. Real smooth. So in Legacy, the format is kind of like the principal conceit of the format is the Brainstorm Experience. Different formats are balanced around different things, and Brainstorm in particular is a card it's in the top half of most busted cards on the restricted list in Vintage, but you can play with 4 copies of it in Legacy, and this has an incredible influence on shaping just sort of the rules of engagement, how the game works, how the format works. And it doesn't surprise me at all to see Brainstorm as the most played, both in terms of deck and in terms of amount played, given that almost universally people are playing 4 Brainstorms who are playing Brainstorms. But this is on MTG Goldfish. They have a resource for some of the most played cards, and this includes all the different deck lists from the current era that they have from every different source for Legacy, and then aggregated like what percentage of them are playing Brainstorm. And in this case, it's almost 62%.
So well over half, almost 2/3. Or the decks are playing Brainstorm?
Yeah, and this is like way beyond what we see in other formats, even for basic land. This is a very, very, very heavily represented card, to say the least.
So I can't help but notice, but right behind Brainstorm as maybe the second most popular card in Legacy is Ponder, right? So Ponder has a lot of what you call the Brainstorm Experience. It's 1 mana, the same as Brainstorm. It looks at 3 cards, which is pretty similar to Brainstorm. It's different, right? Brainstorm takes advantage of like fetch land shuffling, for example, right? Ponder has its own.
But that's actually the Brainstorm Experience that I speak of. Ponder, just as being like hyper efficient library manipulation, it is the best of those, but there are many of them. There's Preordain and Serum Visions and Ponder, and there's all these cantrips that give you varying ways to manipulate the top of your library and draw a card to replace themselves for 1 mana. Brainstorm is in a class all of its own, however. Brainstorm does things like setting up miracles, allowing counterbalance to flip with the right cost, being able to shuffle away cards that you've drawn that are not of use in the spot.
Oh, so that's a key difference between Brainstorm and Ponder, or I guess Brainstorm and most of the rest of these, is if you've already got a card, you can put it on top of your library. Let's say, for example, you're playing against a creatureless deck, and you have Swords to Plowshares in your hand, right? You can put the Swords to Plowshares back on top of your deck and then shuffle it away with a fetch land. But if you had a Ponder, for example, you could set up the top of your library nicely, but you're still stuck with that Swords to Plowshares. So in this case, Brainstorm is almost like drawing an extra card, right? Because you trade a useless card away.
Yeah, and it's tricky because it's easy to imagine that it's just if you have situational cards, but the sort of nature of Legacy is that almost every card is sort of situational except the cantrips, because there are. So let's say you're playing Swords to Plowshares or something like that against a deck with no creatures. Sure, that's one way. You shuffle away a card that's of no, actually two cards frequently. You know, you could shuffle away two plows if you wanted. But there's another part of it, which is, what if you already have 3 land and every land in your deck, or every card in your deck costs 3 or less? Then you may want to just shuffle away land because you don't want them. Or what if your deck is a Reanimator deck and you have a Grizzlebrand or an Emrakul, some kind of a giant creature in your hand? You could shuffle away the Grizzlebrand, and because maybe you've already got one in your graveyard, why do you need another copy? It's not like it's doing any good in your hand. You're never going to get up to 8 mana.
Yeah, those big creatures, even if it's in your hand, we think of the hand as an active zone. You're just never going to have the actual regular resources to cast it. You need to do something tricky with it, like get it out of your graveyard, or
Show and tell, sneak attack.
Well, and it's actually useful in your hand. So
but sometimes you don't want it in your hand anyway, because if somebody's playing with some of the most common forms of disruption in Legacy, like Thoughtseize, Brainstorm can have a very powerful way to interact with them. You can actually just brainstorm and then hide the 2 key combo cards in your hand by putting them on top of your deck so that they're not in your hand when your opponent's Thoughtseize resolves.
Yeah, it's actually even more than that. So sometimes you can have cards that are useful in multiple zones, right? So, for example, a Life from the Loam, right? That card's useful in your hand, and it's also useful in your graveyard because you can take it from your graveyard, put it into your hand via the dredge mechanic, and then it's actually productive for you. You might be in a situation, though, where somebody's casting a Vendilion Click, right? And if they put it on the bottom of your library, that's really bad for you, right? If somebody Thoughtseizes it, that's not that bad for you. So hiding it there could be really useful to keep your engine going later.
Yeah, so there's, and then, of course, just as we alluded to earlier, being able to brainstorm and put a Terminus or an Entreat the Angels on top of your deck, that's pretty good.
It's miraculous.
Yep.
That's Shades of Hain.
Yes.
Except Hain didn't actually have Brainstorm. He just mised the miracle.
Yeah. Now, without Sensei's Divining Top, it's a little bit of a whole new animal. But the ability to still control the top of your library, well, there's less of the whole inherent counterbalance top engine stuff. There's even more value to it's even of more value the fact that Brainstorm is such a effective way to control the top of your deck.
Yeah, I think that one of the it's not underrated insofar that these things actually are going on in deck construction, but it might be kind of under-announced in that people aren't thinking about it this way. These decks that have a lot of brainstorms or brainstorms and ponders, etc., if they have reasonably low casting costs in general, like, maybe they have Delvers and maybe the top end of their curve is a Tarmogoyf, they tend to play way fewer lands than you might expect in other formats. Right, so you can have these decks that are capable of doing pretty interesting things, but only have like 17 lands sometimes, or maybe top up at 20 lands if they're, very resource intensive because they're, say, using some lands as wastelands.
Right, and they even have little ways to occasionally get extra mana with stuff like using Daze to bounce their own land. It actually comes up sometimes where you'll Daze on your turn to force a card through when your opponent tries to force a will it, and then you'll get to replay that same land and cast another 1-drop.
Yep.
But the experience of 4 Brainstorm being legal, 4 Ponder being legal, and 4 Gitaxian Probe being legal, that's so... And those are 3 of the 10 most played cards in Legacy. I mean, every card in Legacy that is legal you can play as a 4 of. But Brainstorm and Ponder are notable for being restricted in Vintage, both. And then obviously Gitaxian Probe being banned in many formats. And I don't know, it's kind of wild just how much library manipulation you're getting that is so effective.
I think that a card like Gataxian Probe being banned in, let's say, Modern, right, but not being banned in Legacy, I think it's counterbalanced somewhat by the presence of cards like Force of Will, right? If you have Gataxian Probe in Modern, that's really allowing you to force through a bunch of different strategies. It's an incredibly powerful card because it both gives you information, but then also gives your deck like some momentum to it, right? Like you're going through more cards. It could be driving Storm. It could be increasing the size of your graveyard. It could be removing life. All these different engines that we have, from Storm engines to Death Shadow engines, etc. It's driving those forward, but in Modern, there's so fewer ways to stop somebody who's going at 100 miles an hour on turn 2. But because there's cards like Daze and Legacy, and also Force of Will, obviously, then I think that there's just like more of a stop sign that you can put on the format.
Yeah. You do have to... Man, actually, that does kind of lead to another question I had for you. What are your thoughts on Daze and Force of Will? Those are kind of zero cost spells, right? It's fair to describe them as kind of zero cost.
Sure.
And Gataxian Probe and Surgical Extraction are never more than 1, and they're frequently 0.
I would say that Force of Will is a zero cost spell more than 75% of the time. Daze is a zero cost spell probably the same, 75-80% of the time. More than that, actually. I don't think people hardcast Daze very often at all. Gataxian Probe and Surgical Extraction, I think, are probably only zero cost like 65% of the time. I think they're both actually, you pay mana for them much more frequently.
So the question I had for you is, what are your thoughts on the 10 most played cards in Legacy? Every single one of them costs 1 or can be played for free.
Well,
it's like 6 different 1-cost cards and then 4 different cards that are alternate casting cost and can be played for free.
Well, so mana is a thing that, and how the availability of mana, right, is the thing where you get all your leverage in Magic, right? So whether you're talking about the fundamental turn, whether you're talking about going from one stage of the game to another, it's just like, how much stuff can I do with how many of this baseline resource do I have? You could push this to the furthest extreme. If a lot of these 0 and 1 casting cost spells are, functionally 0 and 1 casting cost spells, you can just cast way more stuff faster, right? That both makes it acceptable to play fewer lands, like we already mentioned, and kind of get your game going, and you get your game going in a meaningful way, way faster than we can in other formats, right? In Standard or even Modern, you're playing cards that cost 4 or even more mana to just get your baseline game going, right? In Legacy, I would say that's much rarer, even if it's not completely unknown. There are very few cards that you'll legitimately pay 4 or more mana for in Legacy. And I think that's just a function of having so many cards that are playable at such little mana. If you compare a card like Lightning Bolt, there are playable versions of Lightning Bolt that we all run in other formats that cost 2, for example. You just probably wouldn't do that in Legacy. There's too many available things like a Chain Lightning that are close enough to a Lightning Bolt without being a second mana. And I think that's just true up and down the list of functions you might have. You said already there are a bunch of different 1 casting cost Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, Thoughtscour type options. You would just never play any of the 2 casting cost options that we sometimes play in other formats. Like, you'd never play an Anticipate. It's not good enough relative to these things that cost literally 50% of the mana.
Yeah, it's hard when stuff is when everything is a mana cheaper. The difference between a 1-cost card that should cost 2, that's like a higher percentage of savings than a 2-cost card that should cost 3. So, like, I think, although actually, if you keep looking at some of the other cards here, dude, the most played creature, Deathrite Shaman, the most played artifact, Lotus Petal. Like, it's just 1s all over the place.
Well,
but when you switch over to the creature category, suddenly we see a little bit different of a mix.
So I think that's really interesting, and I would love to start with Young Pyromancer from the creatures to begin with.
Sure.
So Young Pyromancer on its face is a 2 casting cost creature, right? So it doesn't cost 1. Deathrite Shaman is the most popular creature at only 1 Golgari mana. But the thing about Young Pyromancer is this is a creature that it's a 2/1 for 2, right? It's R1 for a 2/1. Not exciting, but what is exciting is its text box says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. If you combine this with any of these spells on the other side, right? Brainstorm, instant, ponder, sorcery, etc., largely instant and sorceries, the fact that they're so cheap allows you to cast many of them in a single turn. And when you're talking about Brainstorm, when you're talking about Ponder, they're replacing themselves. Gitaxian Probe is a perfect card for this strategy, right? You're taking an action, you're creating an elemental for the Young Pyromancer, and you're replacing it probably with another 0/1 casting cost spell. You just keep it going. And so I think that even when your strategy involves a 2 casting cost creature, these super cheap 0/1 casting cost spells are making that 2 casting cost creature so much better.
Oh, absolutely. And that actually carries over to most of the other 2 cost creatures on this list. Snapcaster Mage, for instance, obviously well known for being such a powerful card, but it's the second most popular card in Legacy in no small part because of the ability to abuse Brainstorm, Ponder, Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt. And then, obviously, you mentioned Young Pyromancer already, but Baleful Strix, another top 5. Baleful Strix is a 1/1 flying death touch. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Card draw in general is worth more in a format where all the cards you're drawing are undercosted. And so it's very frequently the case that when people play a Baleful Strix, they'll draw into a card that costs 1 that should actually cost more. So they're getting even just more bang for their buck.
Yeah.
And then and Thalia is almost the converse, but for the same reason. Thalia is the 2/1 first strike, Thalia Guardian of Thraben, that 2/1 first strike non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Well, when you're adding 1 to a bunch of 1-cost cards, you're having a much bigger effect than when you add 1 to some 2-cost cards or 1 to some 3-cost cards.
Yeah, those cards all stink, right? All of a sudden, if your deck is designed to cast a large volume of 1 casting cost instants and sorceries, and in fact its mana base is designed that it's contingent on both its cards being cheap and the velocity of those cards driving you through your library to hit your smaller total volume of lands, a card like Thalia Guardian of Thraben really puts the brakes on you, right? Like, if you get this out and, let's say the opponent went first, you played a first turn Ponder or something, they go second turn Thalia, and you don't stop it. Like, you might not have a real third turn. You might not have a real second turn. It can be real tough for you if you can't remove the Thalia from play. Like, casting 1, Ponder or Brainstorm per turn is not going to get you very far against somebody who's attacking you. Right, because Thalia is not going to come by itself, right? That card is it's got 20 buddies.
Now, if you look at the remaining creatures on the top 10 list, they share something in common. The creature, so Stoneforge Mystic is the remaining 2-drop, but Stoneforge Mystic is about mana cheating. You get this tutor, you get to tutor up something like Batterskull or Sort of Feast of Famine or Sort of Fire and Ice or Numazawa Jite, but you can also use Stoneforge Mystic to cheat the Batterskull into play. Grizzlebrand, usually not actually getting hard cast for 8, it's about cheating it into play. Thought Not Seer, even though it ostensibly costs 4,
it costs 2.
It costs 2 because it costs 2 land. Because the decks that play Thought Not Seer play with Eldrazi Temple, Eye of Ugin, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders. They just have so many double lands that in general Thought Not Seer is a turn 2 play. The only exception here being True-Name Nemesis, just being this ridiculous commander card that is so difficult for any deck that's remotely fair to be able to interact with.
Yeah, True-Name Nemesis it's the oddball, right? So it's giving you 1 for a 3/1 creature, Merfolk Rogue. That's not exciting on its face, but its text box says when it enters the battlefield, choose a player probably you'll choose your opponent. True-Name Nemesis has protection from the chosen player, so they can't block it, right? That's one of the really important things. And then they can't target it with targeted removal. Those are like the two big things on True-Name Nemesis. Can't be blocked, can't be targeted. But
it also can't be damaged either.
Can't be damaged.
So Earthquake or some other Pyroclasm, those type of things, not going to do it.
But it has some weird vulnerabilities, right?
True-Name Nemesis has some kind of funny weaknesses, though. Like, even though it's impossible to kill with damage or most types of damage or creature combat or spot removal or whatever, like it has ultra super duper mega hexproof, but its biggest vulnerability comes from either Diabolic Edict effects or other sweepers that don't involve damage, such as Supreme Verdict, Wrath of God, Engineered Plague, and Golgari Charm are two of the most popular super deck cards for Legacy, because if somebody names Merfolk against True-Name Nemesis, now every True-Name Nemesis would come down as a 2/0 and die immediately. And if they Golgari Charm and choose the -1/-1 ability, since it's not targeting, True-Name Nemesis will get that -1/-1 and it'll actually die. And as a result, there's a variety of cards we see in Legacy that are kind of surprising. You don't even see them in Modern very much. Like, for instance, who plays Marsh Casualties in Modern? It's not exactly a super common one, but the fact that Marsh Casualties is a 2-mana answer to True-Name Nemesis that also has extra utility, the ability to kick it, to potentially also take down a Lord of Atlantis or something,
Yep.
So it's definitely a defining card in Legacy in some regards, just because of how difficult it is to interact with. Now, the most common way to interact with it, of course, is still just don't care, right? Like, to just try to race, like, because sometimes if you just if your opponent puts down a True-Name Nemesis and then you sneak attack a Grizzlebrand, sometimes you can just race. Like, that's. But the cards that can actually interact with True-Name Nemesis take on extra value. Things like Liliana of the Veil, Diabolic Edict, all these different cards. Gatekeeper of Malachor even occasionally gets played. The fact that True-Name Nemesis exists has a bigger warping impact than most other cards in the format.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that True-Name Nemesis really, really shines if you're playing against somebody who's trying to be interactive and play on a fair axis, but it's actually pretty underwhelming against an underwhelming relative to its mana cost, I would say, because of how cheap most of the other format staples are. Against either combo decks or decks that don't care about creature combat, like just a mono control deck that has Terminus, or even against like mono offensive decks, right, that can get around it with evasion.
Yeah, there's also a few mono control type of cards that they kind of look like they were engineered to be able to interact with True-Name Nemesis, like Will of the Council. It's basically you and your it's meant for multiplayer. However, it's weirdly legal in Legacy. You and your it costs 3 mana, and you and your opponent vote, and you win ties. So you kind of just get to just hit a non-land permanent of your choice, but it doesn't target. It's weirdly selected by voting rather than targeting. So apparently you're just allowed to vote on it. And
the card is Council's Judgment, right? So
yes.
It has the ability Will of the Council. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Council's Judgment. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Council's Judgment is a sorcery for 1 WW. It has Will of the Council. It says, starting with you, each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control. Exile each permanent with the most votes or tied for the most votes. So it's actually kind of like not a Pernicious Deed. What's the one that?
It's kind of a Chaos Orb, really. But you get to aim. No, it's like a Oblivion Ring, really.
But it can hit multiple things, right?
The thing is, your opponent is going to just choose the same as you because you have to go first. So you're going to choose True-Name Nemesis, and they're going to be like, okay, I choose True-Name Nemesis also. And then you'll be done. The only drawback, quote unquote, is that your opponent gains the ability to exile one of their other non-land permanents if they are so inclined. Like you could say, I want to exile the True-Name Nemesis, and they could say, well, I also want to exile my Juzam Jin.
So if they have a troublesome permanent that they control themselves that could kill them next turn,
Yeah, it doesn't come up very often. It's much more, the voting is more exotic in a multiplayer game. But in Legacy, usually the way it works is your opponent just says the same thing as you. There is also a little twist. You can just get both. Like if you Mindslaver your opponent. But it's...
Because you can take his decision away.
Yeah, but it doesn't usually come to that either. But anyway, True-Name Nemesis... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Baleful Strix for a second because we touched on it. So Baleful Strix is kind of an unusual-looking card. It's a 2-casting cost 1/1, and you're like, hey, why is this so sweet in Legacy? I think there's a couple of things. One of them is when it comes into play, you draw a card, and
that's pretty close to the top.
It's cool, right? But because the cards are so cheap in general in Legacy, just anything that can do something and then also draw a card is actually very valuable because there's not so many bulk card advantage cards that are played at all in the format. Like very few. Like obviously there are some, like people play Jace the Mind Sculptor. Sometimes people play one of X draw card spells, but they're not a huge bulk of them. Far fewer than you would see, for example, in Standard, where a blue-white deck might have 8 or even 10 cards that just have some variation on draw 2 or more cards on them, right? That's not common in Legacy. So just compacting a small amount of card advantage into a card that does something else is valuable. But because it has Death Touch, it can just trade with anything more or less, and it only costs 2. No matter how powerful the card is, it can trade with it. And because it has flying, it can do something like blank a Grizzlebrand, right? So you have a
I wouldn't say blank.
It can deal with the Grizzlebrand so it doesn't murder you to death, right? They can get 7. They can get 7 back, but it can get in the way. It can get in the way of a Delver, and it drew a card.
So yeah, I think so. Baleful Strix. I think the single biggest component of its being played in Legacy is how much it was engineered to be so overpowered. I mean, they would never make this card in Standard. This card is off the charts. Like this card, I think that if it cost 3, it would see play in Standard. But at 2, it's Berserker. It's absolutely just epic. And one of the things that it does so valuable for you is round out a lot of edges. It gives you ways to interact with things like Tarmogoyf without having to have a dead card against control decks. It gives you extra blue cards because there's some combo decks and some different types of decks that, if they're not careful, will end up with too much green mana acceleration or black discard and removal. Well, here, Baleful Strix is a removal spell that happens to also be a blue card that can be pitched to Force of Will, which incidentally is one of the big uses of True-Name Nemesis. It always sounds funny describing, one of its advantages is it can be pitched to Force of Will. But the key is that your blue cards are typically the ones you don't want to pitch against a combo deck. Whether it's Brainstorm, Ponder, another Force of Will, whatever. However, True-Name Nemesis is an easy card to pitch against combo decks because of how much it's never what you really want to be doing against them anyway.
But anyway, not much of a clock, right? So 1 for 2 isn't scaring anybody.
So Baleful Strix also does a couple really cool things that are specific to Legacy. Cabal Therapy is one of the most powerful cards. It's actually, I think, the 11th most played card in the format, at least for non-land cards. Cabal Therapy, another 1-cost card that could be played for free. But Cabal Therapy is a very, very powerful tool in a format where you can just play with 4 Gitaxian Probe and 4 Thoughtseize and whatever, right?
Talk about a card that's insane with Young Pyromancer, which we said before.
Yes. Yeah, Cabal Therapy, its two best friends are usually Baleful Strix and Young Pyromancer because of how much it's just... And Snapcaster Mage is the other big one. But having a cantrip creature that you can afford to get rid of is so good. Whether it's a token created by the Pyromancer or a cantrip like Baleful Strix or Snapcaster Mage. And then finally, Baleful Strix, it's not for nothing that it's an artifact which can be applicable sometimes for things like Thirst for Knowledge, or, it's a combo piece that can be tutored up with things like Imperial Recruiter, so that in a lot of Alurin decks will use Baleful Strix for the ability to just have more cards that'll all be free when you're Alurin, when you have an Alurin going that happen to also just be good on their own. And then it gets used in Cascade decks where people will, and not even just Cascade decks, but Sultai decks in general, where people will have things like the 2/2 Cascade for 1 blue-green. The
Shardless Agent.
Right. And Baleful Strix is a very powerful 2-cost card to reveal to the Shardless Agent. And so often people, the 2-cost and cheaper spells in their deck will be things like Brainstorm, Ponder, the Baleful Strix. It'll be all things that draw a card, so that whenever you play Shardless Agent, you're going to get another card out of it, in addition to the Shardless Agent, sometimes two. So anyway, this is just an excellent, excellent card. And there's lots of tiny little fringe things that come up sometimes. Like how often do you get to actually play with Death Touch creatures in Legacy? Well, it sets up some interesting interactions sometimes, when the Baleful Strix is the one actually dealing the damage.
Sure.
So this is definitely a pretty wild one from the archenemy Deco Bolus sort of supplementary product, like sort of Commander, sort of Conspiracy. I was curious your thoughts, swinging back over to the land, actually. Because I think that if you look at the 10 most played land, it paints a very revealing picture of the Legacy format. Now, it's different depending on if you're talking about how often are people playing them versus how often do they get played. Like how many of them total, because some cards are naturally getting played as a 4 of more often. But if you look at the most played land in Legacy, it's Polluted Delta by a country mile.
Yeah, if you look at the top 5, actually, I think it's pretty interesting as a whole. It's Polluted Delta.
Good. Yes,
Delta 1, Wasteland 2, but then Scalding Tarn 3, Volcanic Island 4, and then Basic Island 5.
With Underground Sea 6, sort of, completing the whole Polluted Delta, Underground Sea, Volcanic Island, Scalding Tarn.
I mean, Flooded Strand 7. These are all blue dual lands, basic islands, or fetch lands, with the exception of Wasteland at 2.
And Wasteland is actually, not only is Wasteland way up there for being the second most played, people who play Wasteland are much more frequently playing 4 because of just how much Polluted Delta, Scalding Tarn, Flooded Strand, they all kind of blur together. Just because of how much people will want to play less than 4. If they don't need both types of basics, like for instance, maybe they're playing 4 Polluted Deltas, but only 2 they're playing 1 Scalding Tarn, 1 Flooded Strand, and 1 Misty Rainforest, so as to be able to avoid getting hit by Pithing Needle on some unfortunate, like somebody Gitaxian probes them and then Needle a fetch land they have 2 copies of, but they weren't going to fetch up a second basic of it anyway. Yeah. Number 8 is an interesting dark horse, though. Plains?
Good old Plains. Yeah, that is... Well, I think that Plains is because, A, you can get it with one of these other top 7 lands being Flooded Strand. There are some blue-white decks. But then also there are just a bunch of white decks, right? Like Death and Taxes, for example, is a very popular non-blue strategy. It must be one of the most popular non-blue strategies.
Well, it's tricky because if you look at the average number of Plains played per deck, it's only 2.8, which kind of, maybe I guess those decks aren't playing that many Plains, but it's just, go ahead.
They've got Caracas, they've got all those Rishodon ports, etc.
Horizon Canopy and all that stuff.
Even if they're technically mono-white.
Yeah. But the use of Plains in various blue-white like a Stoneforge Mystic deck or a Terminus deck, and then Plains also being used in some sort of an Abzan deck as a one-of to go get, or Plains in some kind of, like in some of those Boros decks, some of the Blood Moon Boros decks that we see sometimes, or Jeskai. There's a variety of different decks that'll make use of Plains, and that's to say nothing of the various Death and Taxes or Eldrazi Taxes type of decks. Verdant Catacombs sneaking up there as the next fetch land down without it even being Misty Rainforest. What do you think of that?
Well, remember, you can still get blue dual lands with the Verdant Catacombs, right? A Sultai deck, for example, could get an Underground Sea with the Verdant Catacombs. I think that might be part of it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I also just think that the number of decks that have, like, for instance, when you're playing blue and multiple other colors, you frequently need to be able to go get a single, like to be able to go get a swamp, and you need that swamp to keep executing your game plan. Whether it's casting Tasigur or Gurmag Angler or being able to Thought Seize, whatever it is you need to do, going to get basic swamps so that you can Fatal Push a Goblin Guide without taking extra damage. I guess Underground Sea, whatever, but it's very often not wanting to get wastelanded out. You need that swamp to be able to keep, continue. I think that Misty Rainforest, being able to go find forest, ends up just being a little less common these days, in no small part because of how much Gurmag Angler and Tasigur have supplanted Tarmogoyf as the blue creature of choice, so to speak, when blue wants a beefy brawler.
Yeah, I think that's real interesting, right? So they're very similar to Tarmogoyf in that they are big, right? That they're for Gurmag Angler, for example, its primary characteristic is that it's big, and that they're cheap like Tarmogoyf, and they're cheap in the same way that Tarmogoyf is by riding the graveyard. Tarmogoyf gets bigger and bigger depending on the variety of things in the graveyard, whereas Gurmag Angler and Tasigur get cheaper based on how much stuff you can delve out of the graveyard immediately. But they have a huge advantage. I mean, obviously, Tasigur has the advantage of card drawing in the long game, but both of them have the advantage in that you can't push them, right? A lot of the things that you could kill a Tarmogoyf with, you can't spell snare them. A lot of the stuff that's just like, hey, here's a little cheap guy that I can kill with a variety of things that are designed to fight, on a tempo axis, like 1 mana versus 2. They're immune to those things, and Tarmogoyf is, just going to get killed by them.
Yeah, I mean, plus, very frequently, Gurmag Angler, can come down and be a little bit bigger, or Tasigur drawing those extra cards. But even if Tarmogoyf is on the average slightly better once it's on the table, and that's not even counting out, vulnerabilities to graveyard hate once it's in play. But even counting all that, the amount that black gives these decks is so, being able to pick up discard and graveyard hate and spot removal, whereas the amount that green often brings, it's like, what else are you getting? I mean, people still use it sometimes. It's just, I think, a little bit less common because of how much you can also get that. You can get, if you need artifact or enchantment removal, you can turn to red or white very often.
But, arguably the best green thing that you can get is Deathrite Shaman, which is also black. Right. So, I mean, if people ask, hey, what are you getting in green in the format? I mean, unless they're like elves or something like that, Deathrite Shaman is often the answer. Right, and that's a card that black can do just as well with in terms of acceleration. They often have like some sort of source of green so that they can use the exile a creature ability, but they might only have one in their entire deck.
I also just think that there's some amount of the equation that Blood Moon is a card that people with white spells are going to want to be able to disenchant or just have means to be able to function. And black, they're going to want to be able to just be, keep functioning. Whereas even though green, they're going to want that too some of the time, green is more often, it's more common for green to be in a situation where they're playing with mana elves or creatures, whether it's Birds of Paradise or Noble Hierarch or Deathrite Shaman, as we mentioned. And so it can be less crucial to have a basic forest to operate through a Blood Moon.
I agree.
Well, anyway, it's going to be interesting to see. We're seeing blue kind of already still dominating, but there's this ultra compressed, format built around all this cheap library manipulation and 1 and 0 cost forms of interaction and a lot of threats that are like very often your big threat costs too. And this isn't even getting into Jace the Mind Sculptor, who is better than all.
He's very good in Legacy, in one of the few formats you can actually play him, and he's one of the few cards that people are legitimately willing to pay 4+ mana for to play over and over again.
Well, I think my starting point is going to be trying out the various 3-color blue decks of just good stuff, but I can't help but wonder if there's an opportunity to capitalize on how long it's been since there's been a actual Legacy. There's still Legacy Grand Prix every year, and that's where a lot of advances end up getting made. In addition to just the slow, because it's hard to evolve the format too fast in some ways because of just how many combinations are possible with this many tens of thousands of cards.
Oh yeah. I think that, there are different ways that you can approach Legacy. For me, I think that I would want to have a real single-minded way to, attack my opponent, whether that's like a really focused beatdown deck or a really focused fast combo. And the reason for this is from my perspective is there's so many things the opponent could be doing. If I'm going to be playing a long game that takes multiple turns to win, I have to have all different kind of resources to win a 10 or 15 turn game against these 7 different opponents. But if you're playing like a Reanimator deck or like a Storm deck or a Burn deck, you don't have to think about those things past a certain point, right? Even if you fail, right? You win a lot of the games before the opponent can establish their game plan.
All right, man. Well, out of curiosity, where are you starting? Don't say Burn. Don't say Lava Spike.
If I say Fire Blast, that's a 6 casting cost card, my friend.
All right.
I mean, that's not necessarily where I would end, but from a starting point standpoint, that's where my heart is. That's where my heart is. I do think that it's got a lot of problems, though, right? Like if somebody can play a first turn Iona, you don't really get to play Magic. That's a problem. And there's, storm combo decks, and anyone can beat you if they want to. That's the thing. This format has, if you've got like a super single-minded offensive strategy, there's no shortage of ways that people who are dedicated to beating you will have any problems beating you in sideboarded games. They've got ley lines, and they've got all kinds of things that say protection from you, which I think is... I think that one of the protections that Legacy has is that there's so many decks that people can't load their sideboards with too many of those kind of spells.
No, that's fair. It's tough when there's 45 decks to use those 15 slots.
Yeah, for like real specific stuff, right? Like if you want to add like a bunch of fatal pushes, that works against Affinity and it works against Burn and it works against Tarmogoyf. But if you want to have all ley lines, you want to have, that kind of stuff, it really narrows the kind of defensive interactions you've got going.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing where this ends up going, but I got a feeling you're going to end up sticking with the Fire Blasts anyway.
Yeah, I love Fire Blast. It's a 6 that kind of costs 0. Next week, I think we're going to have 2 episodes because we have an exclusive preview from Rivals of Ixalan. So
we do.
Look out for that next week. Until then, we are Top Level Podcast everywhere. We're Top Level Podcast on our website, toplevelpodcast.com, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and, of course, on Patreon, where you can support us. This week, we'd love to say thank you to John Sheehan.
Thanks, John.
And check us out next week, 2 episodes. Bye, Patrick.
Bye, Michael J.
Life didn't work so great. Tried to play Dredge, use a jail or hate. Ghostly prison waiting for my untapped phase. Your core trapped in amber stasis days. Lost a lot of friends, got left behind. Had to find a way not to lose my mind. Trapped in a vault with nothing but time. Parents and my friends were the key to find. Magic gave me purpose and drive. The game, the love, it kept me alive. Visions of